going. So I'm just going to start by introducing the panel as a whole, and then I'll move into my paper. So for more than 2 centuries, Australia has been institutionalising children. And from as early as the 19th century, there was commentary about children in care, to use more modern terminology, being on sort of an inevitable path to the prison. And as part of the project that Dee and David and I are working on together, we're thinking about challenging this through a range of different approaches to rethinking how we tell this kind of history. And so all of our papers relate into this theme. My paper today is really looking at the 19th century, and particularly on some work that I've been doing, which is attempting to trace the movement of girls and who become women from the child welfare system, so people who are wards of the state, and who later appear in the central register of female convicts. And these are both collections that relate to Victorian system, so in the state of Victoria. So to introduce the actual records that allow me to do this kind of quantitative mapping of this movement, the first set of records are called the children's registers, and they are actually sort of, bound volumes that relate to all children who were admitted into the custody of the department, which goes under different names at different points in time. It starts life as the Department of Industrial and Reformatory Schools. It's founded in 1864 in Victoria, and it was imagined that it was going to be really dealing with a perceived sort of problem youth phenomenon. And so it was imagining that it was going to provide for older children who were either actually convicted of crimes or who were seen as, on the path to committing crimes. And so the system that was set up was a system of industrial schools and reformatory schools, after the sort of idea set out by Mary Carpenter and that was, running already to some extent in Britain. So all the system has are these institutions that are designed for either reforming, sort of reformatory, which is slightly punitive or quite punitive, or the industrial schools, which are imagined as sort of putting older children to training. But in reality, the system immediately becomes essentially a poverty relief system. And there are massive numbers of really young children coming in, and these institutions are really not set up to cope with them. But it's 10 years before anything else is introduced really as an option. And that's when foster care, or boarding out as it was called at the time, becomes an option. But for the first decade, the only option, no matter who you are coming into the system, is that you're going to end up in a carceral institution, which were, very poorly prepared for this. Boarding out's introduced in the 1870s, and then by the mid-1880s, almost everyone except those people in reformatories are either in a work placement or in a foster home. So there's a massive shift in the role of institutions within the system during that period. Despite the fact that we know that the majority of children who come through this system were actually victims of poverty, the idea, the stigma that there was a criminal taint or a potential criminal taint to these children kind of sticks. And this stigma hangs over them. And indeed, we still see this stigma around children in out-of-home care today. So these records are recording the work of that system as children come in, which institutions they go to, where they get moved, and that's sort of the only record of the system that remains. So there's a lot of information that we don't have about the details of the work of the department during these years. But we do have quite an almost complete list of all of the children during this period who were made wards of the state. And they've been digitised in a way that means that I've been able to produce an index of their names, as well as their dates of admission to the department. This graph here actually shows, it gives us a sense of how complete that list might be. So we know in 1864, we can see the pink line, which is the entries in the children's registers, is lower than the numbers that are reported in the annual report. So it looks like 1864 is fairly incomplete, but after that, until 1893, it's fairly complete. And where the line is above the blue line, that's got to do with cases where there's a period where it becomes common for multiple entries to be made per child. So it's not actually that there are more children in the system than are reported in the annual reports. So this gives you an idea that we're talking about 23,000 entries that range between 1864 and 1899, but in the latter part of the period that's less complete. And I'm specifically looking at girls. So in this paper. So that means that there's about 9,900 girls entries representing 7,000 different individuals. So that's the data that I'm working on from that side, and that's fairly complete in terms of the children who moved through the system, the department during that time. The other set of records that I'm comparing them with are the Central Register of Female Convicts. Now, this represents much less than every woman who had a conviction during the period covered. So this table here gives you an idea. It just goes in 5-year intervals, but just to give you a sense, the entries in the Central Register of Female Convicts represents something like the number of women tried and convicted, but it's not exactly the same. And the reason that it's not exactly the same is that on top of the women who are going through the formal process of conviction, which is for the more serious crimes as compared to the women who are like summarily convicted on more minor crimes, it's actually an administration file. So it's about the women who come into the central jail, and they are the women who are serving longer sentences than they really want them serving out in the smaller jails. So it's a bit of a higgledy-piggledy batch of women, but on the whole, they're either women who have been tried, they're serving a sentence that's generally 6 months or up, sometimes as little as 3 months. And so this collection has 6,167 entries from the period 1864 to 1934, although obviously I'm really only looking at it from 1864 onwards because I'm trying to find people who appear in both of these registers. So that's the big picture indexes that I'm working from and what I'm able to map. So I'm a long way short of being able to map every encounter with the law that someone who was formerly a ward of the state might have. But there's something interesting about seeing which of those people who were formerly wards of the state actually do end up having these more serious encounters with the law. So through cross-matching these two lists, and I won't bore you with too many details of that methodology, but you know, I can talk more about it if people are interested in the detail. But I've come up, you know, with from those thousands of names, just 76 confirmed matches. 12 were in jail before becoming a ward of the state and then never appeared back in that central register of female convicts. 2 have go from jail to the department and back to jail, but it's such a short time in the department that I've excluded them from my primary cohort. And what I'm calling a primary cohort for this paper is just 62 girls and later women. They are the people who spend at least 3 months in the custody of the department and then later appear in the Central Register of Female Convicts. And because I'm interested in thinking about what's actually the role of the department in meaning that this is sort of the life path that these women's lives take. If you have read my abstract, you will see that when I really started working on this paper, I actually thought that these women were underrepresented in the register of female convicts. But now that I've finished all this work, I actually have realised that quite the opposite is true. They're actually quite significantly overrepresented. And it's a little bit difficult to give sort of one measure that definitively allows you to say this is how we can measure proportionate representation. But there are two different sort of strategies that I've taken here to trying to give a sense of this. So the first one is this. I have taken and compared the proportion of women in the colony's population who appeared in the Central Register of Female Convicts each year. So a mean rate across this period of 0.06% of women in the colony appear in that Central Register of Female Convicts. The number for people who came through the department each year, so the proportion of girls admitted to the department who can be seen later in the criminal register, has a mean rate of 0.75%. So just on those mean, it's more than 10 times the sort of rate. This graph here shows this with a sort of rolling 5-year average to smooth the line a little bit. And of course, there's an offset. So the pink line shows the year they first appear in the Central Register of Female Convicts, and the blue line shows the year that they first appear in the children's registers. So obviously they're appearing in the children's registers earlier. So there's a bit of a time offset here, and it's almost impossible to completely correct for that. But this blue line is sitting so consistently above the pink line that offset means that it's just still clear that there's an overrepresentation here. The second measure that I have used to look at proportionate representation is to compare the proportion of girls in the colony admitted to the department each year with the proportion of entries in the Central Register of Female Convicts each year who belong to the primary cohort. So despite the chronological offset, again, if women who had been wards of the state were entering the Central Register of Female Convicts at roughly the same rate as other women in the population, we'd expect these figures to be roughly equal. And we can see that with a couple of minor exceptions where we dip down to zero, the pink line, which is the primary cohort, again, is significantly overrepresented. So having sort of come to the conclusion that there is a clear overrepresentation, I think perhaps the more interesting question is, what can we say about the role of the department in this? And what's particularly interesting is that one thing that emerges is that there's a really, really strong correlation between girls who experience institutionalisation as opposed to other forms of placement by the department in this primary cohort going on to appear in the criminal registers. So this graph shows the pink line, the pink lines, represent the number of girls each year who were admitted to the department as non-reformatory cases. So on the whole, they are going to be, most of them are really victims of poverty and family breakdown and social instability. And they are not children who are already on the radar of authorities by having been convicted of offences or even sort of known to police. As we were saying just before we came online, this language around policing is really strong in the way that the Department for Child Welfare talks about the children who come through their doors as well. The blue lines represent girls, young women who come into the system as reformatory charges. So some of them, the charge is only vagrancy. Others, it's something petty theft. They're never particularly major offences, but they they go into different institutions, at least initially. Now, the interesting thing for me here is the change over time. In the early period, a lot of the people who are in the primary cohort, so they're coming into the child welfare system in the 1860s and early 1870s, there's a lot of non-reformatory cases there, as opposed to the later period where most of the people coming through are coming through a reformatory admission. And what's significant about this is that it's this period here where we start to see the change, where we start to see more reformatory cases coming in and the non-reformatory cases dropping off. This is exactly where non-reformatory admissions to the department are starting to be withdrawn from institutions. So this is suggesting a really strong sort of correlation between the actual experience of being institutionalized as opposed to the determining factor being what brings you to the department. And then by the mid-1880s, almost everyone in an institution is in a reformatory institution. We've got one exception in 1888 of someone who came in as a non-reformatory case, but she actually was institutionalized for her entire time under the department. Oh, she did go to a work placement, but she was never sent to foster care. So I'm certainly not making the argument that, you know, foster care is unequivocally better, but I think it is quite interesting to think about the extent to which institutionalizing children can compound the extent to which they are then institutionalized for life. And this kind of phenomenon applies also to the likelihood of women going on to other kinds of institutions like so-called lunatic asylums and asylums for the blind and places like that. So obviously, there's a huge amount that we could read from this data, and I will take this off the screen so that you don't just have to stare at that. But I guess the argument that I'm making here is that we continue to hear today about the extent to which institutionalizing children in their youth tends to have harmful impacts. And now that these records from the 19th century have been digitized, we've actually got the ability to go back and do a quantitative study of the extent to which we see this same pattern in the 19th century. And so that is, I think, really quite a significant finding of this result. It's interesting but not surprising that these women appear to be overrepresented in the criminal register. But perhaps more interesting is that we can see the role that institutionalization itself is playing on their life trajectories. I will leave it there and hand over to you, David.
Okay. Thank you so much, Nell. I'll just make sure that my screen is taken care of. Just bear with me one moment. Great, thank you, Nell. Thank you, everybody. So I'm joining you all from Wadawurrung country in Ballarat in Victoria, and I acknowledge elders past and present. So yeah, the focus of my presentation today will be on a particular institution, or more accurately, a range of different institutions in the same location over a period of more than 100 years, namely the Ballarat Children's Home, which is also known previously as the Ballarat Orphanage, and in the 19th century as the Ballarat District Orphan Asylum. So these institutions have been a really strong focus of my research over a number of years. And for this presentation today, I've looked at the histories of this place, or rather the histories of the children of this place, through a lens of absconding, to kind of use some of that criminalised language that Nell was just referring to, and to kind of try and apply a different filter through this institutional history. This surprisingly persistent terminology that's used to describe children who escape from their confinement in institutions such as this. The different kind of institutions to the ones that Nell was just describing, which I hope will become apparent as we go through. But first, some background. The Ballarat District Orphan Asylum was established in 1866 when 9 children first came to live there. And over the next 100 century or more, 117 years, it was home to over 4,000 children, usually around 200 at a time, both boys and girls. And it still exists today, but in a much more modernised form, a very different form, as a community sector organisation in Ballarat known as CAFS, which stands for Child and Family Services. So it was a non-denominational institution, non-religious, and was established and managed by a community committee. And much has been made of this by the institution itself over its history, especially now, actually, these days. It's a good point of difference from the Christian-dominated social service sector and has allowed the organisation over time to present itself as a uniquely humane and beneficent sort of organisation, different to others. But when you look behind that a little bit, in the 19th century especially, with a sort of a Catholic-led residential services system that was sort of emerging at that time, independent community organisations like this one, the Orphan Asylum, sort of end up by default as sort of proxy Protestant organisations, to the extent that through the 20th century, in correspondence with the state, the orphanage is sometimes referred to by the state officials as the Ballarat Protestant Orphanage, to help them distinguish it from similar Catholic institutions in Ballarat, though it wasn't a Protestant orphanage at all. It was just an assumption that was made. And so, you know, the religious social politics of the Goldfields isn't the point of this presentation, though it would be interesting. But I just kind of use that as an example to help illustrate a way of thinking about this lens through which I'm talking today. And it's the ways in which an organisation like this sees itself, and that the stories that it tells about itself and that are then told about it elsewhere, these stories heavily influence the ways in which systems of welfare and control are played out. And that's true today as well as it is through history. And just to get the theoretical stuff out of the way, it is a theoretical concept known as narrative identity formation. Margaret Summers is a prominent writer in this field, and it's about sort of helping to make sense of the social world through the development of narratives that intersect personal and social experiences, in this case of an institution. So the quote I've got here, all of us come to be who we are, however ephemeral, multiple and changing, by being located or locating ourselves, usually unconsciously, in social narrative, and rarely narratives of our own making. So just to kind of hold that in mind a bit, and we'll sort of refer back to it. And I guess to emphasise that this idea applies at both the collective and the social level, like I said before. And also highlighting that there are cultural and historical influences on problems that we often perceive as simply structural or simply systemic. And I just want to also emphasise, just through a little shout out at the bottom there, that, the really pioneering work of others in this field who I've been lucky enough to work with, Jacqueline Wilson and Frank Golding, but also the work of John Murphy, who sort of added to this field a lot through survivor activist sort of research, and who have done more than many to challenge organisation on social approaches of these sort of texted pasts, by exposing their own perspectives on their own records. And I guess the point is, the stories we tell ourselves matter, not just the systems and structures we find ourselves in. And so I've been doing a bit of work with this modern organisation, CAFS, to be rethinking the kinds of histories it's telling about itself. Maybe a bit more on that later if we get a chance. Okay, so as promised though, we can do a reading of this concept of absconding through the histories of Ballarat Children's Home and its predecessor organisations. And by way of a really quick sort of, sorry but not sorry apology, there'll be a lot of names coming at you now. These aren't real names, but they are real people. And it's just, to kind of help us keep track of some of these stories, but it might get a bit, confusing. So in the 19th century, in this very early period, we only have access to what's written about children at the time, and mostly in official records like board reports, but also in newspapers. So there's a few examples that I've been able to find. So in 1884, a boy called Morgan ran away from the orphan asylum. He had absconded from the institution and the superintendent had taken action to find his whereabouts, but without success. This is quotes from the board reports at the time. A month later, we get an update. The whereabouts of Morgan was known and that he would be brought back to the asylum as early as possible. And then a few months later in the board, we've got another update. The committee receives a letter from a man called John Carey, returning an amount of £2, being the amount of reward paid for the recovery of D. Morgan. So John Carey was the one who'd located Morgan and alerted the orphan asylum, although he clearly didn't do it for money because he was returning the reward. But Morgan wasn't returned to the asylum. He was, as we see the quote here, he was employed in a nice, comfortable position with Mr. Thomas Bath at Swanwater West, which is about 200 kilometres away, and is getting 6 shillings a week, and his employer is very much satisfied with him. And that's all we hear. Just the committee just says, yep, received. We got that letter. And so there's sort of a level of satisfaction that this is a good outcome for Morgan. Just some other really quick examples. In the early 1900s, William Millison escapes. He escaped 7 times, or attempted to escape at least, in the early 1900s, including the classic tie up the bed sheets and scale down the window at 2 a.m. in the morning. And actually the Melbourne Argus newspaper reports that he's been able to elude his pursuers. And in 1900, Charles and Roland, they get on a train to Bacchus Marsh, which is a town about 50 kilometres away from Ballarat, between Ballarat and Melbourne. And unfortunately for them, they fell asleep on the train and ended up at North Melbourne train station. I've done that before, where he was apprehended for fare evasion and handed over to the police. And when they found out where he come from, they sent him out on the next train and to the police in Ballarat, where the superintendent picked him up and explained that he had to pay 4 and 6 for the train fare. So the point, I'm sorry, I'm rushing through this, but the point here is that there's sort of a level of trust and a somewhat relaxed approach to the issue of escape. And these are probably just the ones that the institution was comfortable recording officially. But I think it comes in some way from this public stance and position that the institution saw itself as fulfilling. And that is, it was the self-proclaimed institution for children of honourable parents. I could show you the quote, but we'll just take me at my word. That's how they describe themselves. The children of honourable parents, in contradistinction to the government-run organisations that had been established for the criminal and neglected children, those institutions that Nell was just talking about from 1864. So these community organisations were set up to be opposite, not for the criminal and neglected. And so then we see in the way that they treat absconding here. Morgan is virtually congratulated, for furthering his station, and a little pat on their own backs for providing such a good boy for this new employer. For Charles and Roland, there's a sort of comical tone about their pursuit by police, but this level of trust that they're going to, just be sent back to Ballarat. And then we see in William's case, he's absconds and returns 7 times. They're giving him a lot of chances, and it's a really different tone and result to that of the 20th century. So a few more examples. So we jump forward a little bit, but in the 1950s, 2 boys are absconded from the home and were picked up by the police in Melbourne by the police. One was returned to his mother and the other was sent to Royal Park Depot. So let's just keep that in mind. What's the next one? In 1952, Annette Clifford was absconded 4 days after she arrived at the orphanage and was returned to Royal Park. And in 1960, Mr. Taylor took his son out of the orphanage and took him to his home in Warwick-Nabil without permission. And here's the quote from the board report. The boy was soon returned along with an apology from Mr. Taylor. So the point here is, in this middle period, the orphanage era in the 20th century, that the independent community organisation was no longer really very independent at all. So from the Great Depression onwards, these sort of middle-class guardians, of which children did or didn't deserve care and support, after the Depression, they were sort of rubber stamping the decisions of the state as state wards came to dominate in the dormitories. So it became a sort of a key part of the statewide network rather than a local place for local children. And so we start to see, that language changing in these ways of treating absconding is seen in different ways. Royal Park Depot, which, is the main state-run youth justice facility to this day, becomes a more prominent part of the discussion. And we're seeing this kind of reference to a network. Mr. Taylor feels that he needs to return his child with an apology because of this, the sort of the shifting kind of culture. So there's this dual pressure, this kind of cultural pressure around the institution and how it sees itself, and the external pressure of the criminal justice system, and comes together in this story of Marcy Wilkinson. This one's a different one because Marcy's talking about this incident herself many years later in an oral history project run by the National Library. So she had a short-lived escape attempt that had serious ramifications for her future. So one evening, Marcy and her friend climbed out of the window with packed cases while the others were watching movies. As they were making their way over the grounds, the superintendent was going for a stroll in the garden. Marcy and her friend dropped their cases, climbed over the fence and ran away into the city, walked into the city with no money, no clothes. The police got them and they were returned to the orphanage. And this is how Marcy describes it now. In the eyes of those running the orphanage, she remembers, running away was a dreadful thing to do. And she was made to feel ungrateful for all that had been done for her. She felt ostracised and told that even her best friend didn't want to know her, and that her school teachers were shamed by her, and that nobody wanted to see her at the school that she was going to, even though she actually loved school and she was doing really well at school against all odds. 2 weeks later, she made the decision not to return to school, but to leave the orphanage and take a job in Melbourne. Massive life trajectory change right there. And those kind of expectations that are kind of put on her. So jump forward a couple of decades, and this pattern that I've described above becomes further entrenched, and the state networks are now more sophisticated and ubiquitous. So between 68 and 83, the children's home era, you might call it, there were 12 children who were recorded as absconded. So notice here that there's a much more systematic approach to recording these things. It's more professional than the handwritten notes of, like, the ones that the board thinks about talking about or not. It's actually much more systematic, and that's reflective of other trends. But anyway, so of the 12, almost all of them are subsequently found and then transferred to another facility. 6 went to other state-run processing facilities, as they were known, Allambie in Melbourne, Warrawee in Ballarat mainly, while 5 went into state-run juvenile justice facilities, Tirana and Baltara in Royal Park and Winbirra, or Winlayton in Nunawading. And these are very much kind of part of that sort of, youth justice system. In 1970, 2 of our girls, as the superintendent put it, Kirsten Gray and Grace Hobbs, were transferred to Winbirra, which is the remand section of Winlayton after a late night escape attempt from the Ballarat Children's Home. So Kirsten came back to the Ballarat Children's Home after about 3 weeks, but Grace remained at Winbirra and presumably further into that youth justice system and away from the records of the Ballarat Children's Home. So the point I'm trying to make, in these details, we can see the traces of the organisation's initial self-identity as the place for the heavy, in inverted commas here, good kids who deserved to be looked after. In the later era, once kids start to show a form of defiance by running away, they're either sent away to this kind of more comprehensive network of incarcerating institutions for children, or they're ostracised to the point that they feel that they have no options but to move on. And so this broader point relates back to what I was saying about narrative identity formation, both contemporary and in considering histories, and the ways in which we describe ourselves as institutions, let's say. The way in which we describe ourselves is affected by the decisions we need to make to help justify ourselves and our actions as institutions. And in the cases of history, the kinds of histories that we tell ourselves, these can unconsciously affect practices in our contemporary times, as we're kind of seeing in some of the practices of absconding in the 1970s and 80s, and we can see it now. So if you remember what Margaret Summers was saying earlier on, social narratives not of our own making come to define who we are. Now, this is at a collective and organisational level. At the individual level, it has disastrous consequences, personal consequences, as we saw with Marcy, and her decision to abandon school, to leave school because she felt no longer able to fit into the institutional self-identity of the good kids and the good people narrative identity that had formed over 100 years. So the task now with CAFS, this modern organisation, is to build new historical narrative identities that help distance itself from this old and worn-out idea of deserving and undeserving recipients of welfare, but which has actually unconsciously affected its strategies and approaches well into the 21st century. And that those new narratives need to be formed along the lines of the stories now available to us through the direct testimony, recollection, and alternative record keeping of people like Marcy, and frankly, dozens of others who are keeping their own records and being able to access them. And that's where the work of Frank Golding and Jacqueline Wilson and others is really, really, like I said before, groundbreaking and important. I'm happy to take questions on what we're doing with CAFS and how we're kind of going about that, but I've got a feeling I might be close to the end of my time. I do just have one more kind of story that I wanted to tell. If someone could let me know if I should stop.
I think, sorry, I'm going to confess that I forgot to start recording in relation to you, David, but I've been completely enthralled. So, and also I realised that we have 3 speakers as opposed to 4 across many of the panels, so we actually have a little bit more time than I.
Okay, I'll if you don't mind, Dee, I'll just quickly tell this story, because it's a pretty important one. So, and just a content warning about abuse. So if you're looking at the superintendent reports over the course of the 20th century, to be honest, and I've quoted some of these numbers, but the numbers of absconders officially recorded were quite small. We're not talking about huge numbers. But in the mid-1960s, there was this surge of absconding. Not huge, but a noticeable increase. And so this is the superintendent who was reporting to the board about groups of girls mainly who were running away and his dealings with the police as they returned to the institution, not moved on to other institutions, as we saw was happening more and more around this time. And it's accompanied by a lot of commentary from the superintendent to the board about a deterioration in the behaviour of the children and a need to enforce more discipline, especially amongst girls. Red flags when you read this now, and yes, with absolutely good reason. Much has been written and spoken about this in recent years, and I'll give you a link to this. But at the time, one of the most egregious cover-ups of institutional abuse possible. So the superintendent, the CEO essentially of the organisation, was a man called Hilton Sedgman, who was sexually abusing children in his care, perpetrating. He was charged in 2015 with this, but by a legal technicality, he never went to trial, so hasn't been convicted due to his health, state of health. And yeah, but there's an extraordinary episode of Background Briefing on ABC Radio last year by investigative journalist Charlotte King from ABC Ballarat. Here, the memo that erased the scandal. And so at the time, when the police were coming across these girls and boys, but mainly girls, coming into the police, they were raising the alarms based on the interviews they were having with those girls and escalating their concerns. And it got to the commissioner, but all the inquiries were quashed, and it involved the president of the orphanage board, the mayor of Ballarat, some former local MPs, the Victorian Solicitor General and Attorney General, and Charlotte King has uncovered all of this material. One of the girls was forced to front the board of management and apologise to them, withdraw her complaints, and was forced out of the orphanage. And she went from dux of her school class to working in an interstate curtain factory within a year. And a few months later, Sedgman, the superintendent, suddenly and quietly moved on after just 2 years in the role, with very little paper trail. And the previous 2 superintendents, to put that in context, had served for 6 decades between them, and this man served for two years. So I guess what I'm saying is, in this instance, we have a literally unspoken culture and an agreement essentially that the image of the institution is more important than the safety of children. And it's a dynamic that we're familiar with here in Ballarat and elsewhere, especially since the Royal Commission. It's one in which the community is complicit. And, you know, to be honest, the silence since this story broke in April 2021, last year, has been deafening. And so I just thought that was an important kind of context to kind of put in there, and sort of the ways in which patterns of absconding and this kind of criminalisation and sort of disciplining of children is actually being used as a way of justifying and covering up these awful occurrences. Anyway, thank you. Apologies for going a bit longer. I'll put a link to this story and the podcast that Charlotte King has done.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Nell. And I'm just going to share my screen and hope that all works. That's all working? Great. Thank you. I'm Michell, and I'm talking to you today from Ghanaland in South Australia. Louise Henry, who is based at James Cook University, says that she had an idea for her creative writing PhD of writing a novel about the very different lives of her two grandmothers as they represented such diverse social experiences. One grandmother came from a wealthy family in Otago, New Zealand, and the other was in and out of foster care, kinship care, and the Townsville orphanage between the ages of 9 and 13 when she went to work. I usually chuckle or laugh inappropriately, some would say, when I think about my children's grandparents. On the one side, there is eminent respectability, as the children's paternal grandfather once served as mayor of the city of Woodville and in a northwestern suburb of Adelaide. There's some oddness on that side of the family too, as the grandparents were long-standing members of the Christian Science Church, a small woman-founded American denomination which emphasises spiritual healing, even as Grandpa owned a couple of very successful pharmacy businesses. But mostly there is respectability. On the other side of the family, on my side, there is disgrace. This is part of a report by what's called a woman police constable, Audrey Chommel, as if you wouldn't know by her name that she's a woman, who interviewed my mother in her place of work at around 9:30 p.m. on the 12th of December, 1959. She was a short order cook at the Lewis Cafe in Bank Street in the city. She was expecting to work until 11 p.m, but was told by Constable Chommel that she needed to go home as her husband, my father, had been arrested for drunk driving. The officer was aware that there were 6 of us children at home alone, the oldest being only 9. My mother tells the police officer that she's working because my father will be off work for 3 weeks over Christmas and they need the money she earns. I'm warning you now, Mrs. Timms, responds the constable. It is your duty to be at home with your children. 2 days later, on the 14th of December 1959, Eileen Moran, another woman police constable, interviewed my mother, who wanted some advice. She had lost her job and my father had been to court and received a £79 fine for drink driving, but he didn't have the money to pay for it. Constable Moran suggested that my mother go to the Children's Welfare Department. She said, plenty of people in your position live on relief. But if you were to leave your children with no one to care for them, I am warning you, we would have to arrest them and place them in a home. I wouldn't like that to happen, but I don't know what to do, responded my mother. Well, you know what will happen if you leave your children, said the constable. I don't remember anything about an arrest, nor do I recall appearing in the juvenile court on the 19th of January the following year. I and my siblings were charged with being neglected and we were committed to children's homes. My parents were imprisoned for 2 months for the neglect of their children. I wasn't in that children's home for long. I went into foster care with my younger sister on the 22nd of February 1960, and I vividly recall that day. This is where I lived until I was 18. I'm always struck by how tiny this house is. It wasn't like that when I was living there. As a young person, I was not involved at all with the juvenile justice system. I did, however, around the age of 17, have a netball coach who was a police officer and, concerned that I had no knowledge at all of my biological parents, organised a couple of mugshots for me. When I consider contemporary research on the so-called care to prison pipeline, there was little likelihood that I would end up in the juvenile justice system, even though I had been treated as a criminal when I was a small child. I had done well at school. I was even enabled to matriculate or complete high school. I didn't live in a high crime area. I didn't associate with any dodgy characters, although one so-called uncle should have been locked up. I had been in the one stable foster care home. I wasn't in residential care, where police are often relied on to manage children's behaviours, as others have pointed out. Even my files have only positive comments about me, including that I should do well at university, and eventually I did, but that took a while. As an adult, the only contact with police I've had was when I was dating a copper as a young woman and when I've been a victim of crime. Unlike my biological parents, I've only ever had speeding fines, nothing more serious. Usually what is talked about in research is that children who've been in out-of-home care are overrepresented in the youth justice system and adult prison populations. I see this as an indictment on the state care system, certainly not on the children or young people, although they are all too often seen as problems to be dealt with rather than human beings with just as much potential as anyone else. And I'm quoting there from a UK politician, Belle Ribeiro Addy. Clearly more needs to be done for children in out-of-home care if, as Kath McFarlane says, they are not to be further disadvantaged by the out-of-home care system that is meant to protect. What is less talked about is that the majority of children in care do not offend, and I'm quoting from an Australian Institute of Family Studies short article by Susan Badawai in 2017. If I can continue with that sentence, you can see what is highlighted and links out to a research article is the overrepresentation of kids in state care in the juvenile justice system. In other words, the emphasis usually is on those who do offend, although at least Badawai does have that important first clause that the majority of children in care do not offend. Many don't say that, they only talk about the overrepresentation. The BBC reported on care leavers going to university on the 1st of this month, and one of the young women interviewed, Rosie Campbell, said that if foster care was mentioned at all at the high school she was in, it was in a negative way. She said it was to talk about why certain people were statistically more likely to go to prison, which doesn't really help to give kids in foster care much hope for the future. Even when care experienced people do go to university, say Rosa Marvel and Samantha Child, having been in care tends to dominate the way they are seen, which is often as deviant. They go on to say that, and I quote, positive stories such as Andrew Walther and Harvey's insights into Australian care experienced students' psychological strengths are sidelined. If we don't consider that care leavers might be in our audience, then we need to think about what prejudices, misconceptions, stereotypes we are holding. If the only story we tell is that one story of the overrepresentation of kids in care in the juvenile justice system, or the overrepresentation of people who've been in out-of-home care in the adult prison system, then we are contributing to the marginalisation and stigmatisation of all kids in the state care system. As sociologist Norbert Elias observed in the 1960s, a sure way to stigmatise and exclude any group is to tell the worst story about them and the best story, of course, about your own group. Instead of focusing on the overrepresentation of kids from care in juvenile detention or prison, we could say that even though the majority of kids in care never offend, some do when they're overrepresented, and we should figure out what's going on for them. We could also tell stories about people who've been in care and prison and who have gone on to become major iconic figures. South African anti-apartheid activist Nelson Mandela was in foster care from the age of 9. After spending around 27 years in prison, on the 10th of May 1994, he was inaugurated as South Africa's first Black president. He was 77 years of age by then. Yeah, nah, I can hear you say, that example doesn't really work because Mandela was in the foster care of a chief and he was also a political prisoner. I take the point, he's not your regular crim, but still he was in prison for a total of 27 years. Perhaps African-American human rights activist Malcolm X is a better example. At the age of 13, Malcolm Little became a ward of the state. He was in foster care in a juvenile detention centre before living with his sister from the age of 15. From 1946 until 1952, he was in adult prisons for burglary and larceny. Prison led to what Jed Tucker calls the dramatic intellectual birth of Malcolm X, and he benefited enormously from the experimental vision of Norfolk Penal Colony Superintendent Howard Gill, who valued and promoted education for the inmates. Malcolm X famously became a member of the Nation of Islam in 1948 when he was still in prison. In 1950, he began using X in place of his family name, which he said replaced the white slave master name of Little that had been imposed on his forebears. Malcolm X was a controversial figure, but he is now a celebrated one. Justin Warland in the Time magazine on the 50th anniversary of Malcolm's assassination wrote, Malcolm X is often listed beside the likes of Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks as an influential figure in the struggle for Black equality. That's because the lesson he offers about the importance of change has been constant throughout the decades. At the heart of his newfound status is a story of persistence in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Probably less well known in Australia is French writer and playwright Jean Genet. Jean Genet was abandoned by his mother to a foundling home and then raised in foster care. At the age of 15, he was sent to the notorious Mettray prison. In 1948, Genet was found guilty of theft for the 10th time and only avoided automatic life imprisonment because of appeals made on his behalf by the poet and artist Jean Cocteau, with support from writers such as Jean-Paul Sartre. Jean Cocteau had organised for the publication of Genet's first novel and presented him as the greatest writer of the modern era. Thus, says Colin Ripley, Genet's writing literally allowed him to escape from prison. In Australia, of course, there is the amazing Jack Charles, famous member of the Stolen Generation, actor, activist, and cat burglar, who was in and out of prison something like 22 times from the 1970s until 2006. In his 2017 TED Talk, Jack Charles talks about how he wished he had someone like him, and I quote, to implore him to lead him on a better path. Although he was at times foiled by his criminal record, Jack Charles was in his later years engaged in considerable community work, including as an ambassador for the Archie Roach Foundation, mentoring young Aboriginal Australian detainees. A state funeral service to honour Jack Charles was held in October this year and live streamed into Victorian remand centres, youth detention centres and prisons. But what about the notorious criminal Lenny McPherson, Mr. Big, I hear you ask? Lenny McPherson was born in Balmain in 1921. He was the youngest of 10 children, although some sources say 9. He left school at 12. He was 13 when he was first incarcerated at Gosford Training School for Boys at Mount Penang. At Gosford, the young Lenny was physically and sexually assaulted. Gosford operated a borstal system, says journalist Jack Hoisted. This system of punishment was, and I'm quoting, something that we'd adopted from the Brits, where the most senior kids, 16 and 17-year-olds, would mete out the discipline under the watchful eye of the guards, end of quote. Lenny McPherson apparently talked about the brutality from older boys and guards for the rest of his life. McPherson's first conviction as an adult was in 1946 for receiving stolen goods, and he was sentenced to 18 months hard labour at Long Bay. He served 10 months and became a police informant. He kept up that practice once he left, surviving, say, Michael Duffy and Nick Horden, a reputation as a snitch, as Lenny the Squealer. The contacts McPherson made with the New South Wales Police while in prison were the basis for his considerable success, according to Duffy and Horden. Being a police informer allowed McPherson, says Jack Hoisted, to inform strategically against others involved in crime, but there weren't any negative consequences for him. Macpherson was incarcerated again in 1953, and it was when he was on parole in 1956 that he began working with police officers Ray Kelly and Fred Cray. According to Ray Kelly, a good detective relies on informants. There were, however, allegations of Kelly being corrupt, same with Fred Cray. One of the stories about Kelly is that when Macpherson beat his first wife almost to death, Kelly ensured that Macpherson wasn't tried for attempted murder. Instead, his wife was guaranteed safe passage out of the state. From what I can tell, Ray Kelly was not in the care system, and yet is regarded as Sydney's most powerful corrupt policeman, with some writers arguing that he continued to be a major force in Sydney's corruption for many years after his retirement. In the end, Lenny Macpherson died in prison in 1996. He'd been convicted 18 months earlier of conspiring to have a Sydney policeman beaten. Hoysted cites the names of a few men who were in Gosford and who became criminals, including Stan Smith and George Freeman, who with Macpherson formed what Hoysted calls the trio of Sydney crime. Hoysted is clear that not all people who've experienced the sort of trauma Macpherson did do turn to crime. He also notes, however, that many of the top criminals from the 60s, 70s and 80s had been through a so-called reform school. One of those who had been in Gosford, or Mount Penang as it was by then, and in an adult prison, but who also chose to give up a life of crime, is poet Robert Adamson, or the poet of the Hawkesbury, as he is also known. I want to call him the Birdman, but that name has already been given to another Robert Stroud, a notorious American murderer portrayed in the 1962 film, The Birdman of Alcatraz by Burt Lancaster. Robert Adamson was 12 when he went to court for stealing birds from Taronga Park Zoo, including a paradise rifle bird. If he'd been more contrite when he went to court, he might have been let off, but he challenged the magistrate by saying he didn't think he'd done anything wrong because, and I quote, "How can anyone own a bird? Only God can own a bird." From then, for about 10 years, he was in and out of boys' homes and adult prisons. In an interview for the ABC Radio National program Poetica in 2020, he says, "People say to me, oh, gee, you've had a hard life. You've been to boys' homes and reform school and prison. But I think if I hadn't grown up in Neutral Bay and had access to places like Balmoral and the Hawkesbury River, I would have been a big mess. But whenever I was in deep trouble or serving solitary confinement or something like that in Long Bay, I would just visualize what it was like growing up in those places. I could be suicidal sometimes, but I'd think, no, don't die yet. I've got to go one more time on the river." Unsurprisingly, Robert had wanted to be an ornithologist, but he was discouraged by the qualifications required. He had trouble at school because of undiagnosed dyslexia, which wasn't even a thing back then. It was while he was in Long Bay that Robert was inspired by Bob Dylan to try writing songs. A visiting priest read his songs and described his work as poetry. Adamson says, "But then he gave me a book of Gerald Manley Hopkins' poems, which had poems about birds. So I started doing versions of those poems. I wrote a whole book of poetry." He couldn't take that book of poetry out of the prison because that would have been stealing government property. So he set about rewriting them and then went along to a poetry workshop at Sydney University run by writer David Malouf and academic Jim Tulip. Later, he became friends with artist Brett Whiteley, who also loved Bob Dylan. These men became great supporters of Roberts, who was soon president of the Poetry Society, editing the New Poetry magazine and setting up a small publishing business with his partner. He has won all the major Australian poetry awards, and in 2011, Robert Adamson became the inaugural chair in poetry at the University of Technology, Sydney. A final person I want to talk about briefly, so you don't think it's just the old blokes whose stories can be told, is Keenan Mundine. Keenan Mundine was born and raised on Gadigal land in Redfern. By the time he was 7, both his parents were dead. Keenan and his brothers were separated and taken by relatives, and Keenan went to live in La Perouse. When he was 14, Keenan left home to find his brothers. He found one was already heavily involved in the criminal justice system and addicted to drugs. Left to fend for himself, Keenan was schooled in stealing televisions and computers by older boys and men. By the time he was 16, he was homeless, injecting heroin and in and out of juvenile detention. At 18, Keenan was in adult prison and feeling alone and isolated. 6 years later, he decided he did not want to go back to prison, but he found it difficult to get paid work because of his criminal record. Keenan Mundine is now married with 2 sons and is the co-founder and ambassador for Deadly Connections, an Aboriginal organisation set up to break cycles of disadvantage. One of Keenan Mundine's heroes of history is Nelson Mandela. One strand of the project that I'm working on at the moment with Nell and David is to tell the life stories of people who've been displaced from their families as children. This is what we call a form of historical advocacy, a way of disrupting a seemingly relentless deficit discourse. And instead of telling stories that reinforce, and instead tell stories that reinforce narratives of survival and contributions to community. Even if care leavers get caught up in the juvenile justice system or the adult prison system, that's not necessarily the end of their story. On our site, you'll find Nelson Mandela, Malcolm X, John Gannay, Jack Charles, Robert Adamson, and Keenan Mundine, although not the likes of career criminals such as Macpherson. You'll also find that there are many people there who have never been in any sort of trouble with the law. There's Brian Tennant, for example, who wasn't in prison himself, to my knowledge, but who was involved in prison reform, helping to get innocent men released from prison and arguing for better treatment of prisoners. And I'll finish with Ivor Knight, who in 1968 joined the Western Australian Prison Service, working his way up until in 1986 he was appointed superintendent of Fremantle Prison. People who've been in the state care system aren't a homogenous group, and we should ensure that we don't tell the one negative story about them, even when our intention is to improve their situation. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to turn the room mics back on so we can hear from audience here. And to invite those others online as well to share any comments or questions in the chat. So we have about 20 minutes, which is fantastic. 3 fascinating papers with some great threads connecting through them, noting, of course, that they derive from this larger project, but also some interesting points of departure or differences across the papers. So I'm going to invite not only those in the room and online comment or to ask questions, but the panelists themselves might want to ask a question of one another. So does anyone have any comments or questions to get us started?
I've just got a little one. I think all 3 papers were talking about the process of institutional voice. But I couldn't help wondering, even though you're recuperating or giving agency, the voice of the other is coming through, I wanted to know within what you're reading, and particularly the second paper, do we have any sense of the boys' voices or the girls' voices prior to the 1960s? Or was it only ever the institutional voice that was being recorded? So I guess the thing is there any way of hearing the voices of those children in those absences? Are they present in their absence in some way?
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, really good question, and sort of in some ways the elusive challenge of working with children's histories and institutional histories. The short answer, in terms of do we have those voices from before, let's say the 1940s or 50s onwards, I haven't been able to find much at all. And certainly not much of anything even within that era written at the time, like even Marcy's story that I was talking about, and most of the story are of people talking retrospectively in memory. So yeah, I mean, there's a sort of it's something we would like to be able to do, but that we're not able to do. And so I guess the challenge is to read around the official records. And I guess that's a big sort of limitation in terms of what you might call a empirical approach to history, or something where you're looking for evidence, in the records. The records are more often than not obscuring than revealing. So yeah, it's a process of reading multiple texts, reading multiple perspectives. There's sort of an approach, or a theoretical approach, empathic inference, where you're sort of reading texts from an empathetic point of view, and then trying to infer from there, rather than treating texts or records as proof or otherwise of what really happened and what didn't. But I mean, even within that, like the one really, going back to those earlier eras, I haven't been able to find much. Nell has done a lot of work here, and may have had a bit more luck and have some techniques around that. But sort of there's one really great piece of primary, source that I found from the 1970s, actually, which is this amazing newsletter that was, the residents' newsletter, sort of written at the time. And it's probably the main example of, self-consciously written work from this institution in particular. There's lots of other similar examples. But even on the front of that, I'm trying to remember the quote, but on the front of it, it had this quote, and I've tried to trace it back, and it was like Richard Nixon actually said this quote, but it's something like, I know that you think, I know what you think. You may think that I know what I'm saying, but I can tell you what you know is that you don't know what I'm saying. It's almost like this warning to me as the historian in generations to come. It's like, don't read too much. Don't try and think that you're discovering the authentic voice here through all of this, because it's an elusive task. So we need to be, and I guess that, so I kind of loved that, this kind of warning that I was getting, to just, yes, you're getting the real voice here, but like actually it's just a version of multiple voices. And there's a further challenge in that, I suppose, looking, if we only look for the voices that had agency and that were able to, sort of present themselves, then we're actually excluding all these other voices that never got the chance to kind of say. So sometimes in sort of valorizing or sort of preferencing those who are able to speak for themselves at that time, and treating that as sort of the only authentic sort of voice from the time, we're sort of cutting ourselves off to all sorts of other perspectives. So I guess, it is an elusive challenge. And I try to counter that by reading around and sort of reading through the sources as texts, as much as possible. I don't know if Nell, you've got...
I just thought I would add, I'm continually finding new ways to try and read against the grain of sources, because certainly for the 19th century, where I've done most of my work, there's no unmediated voices of children who are in these institutions, because they're always either through newspapers or writing things that have to go through the department, or they are adults reporting something on a record. But so I often look to actions and the classic example is reading, looking at a pattern of absconding and asking, what's going on. But one that I hadn't seen before that actually came out of the quantitative work that I've been doing with the group of women that I was talking about today. And actually I was expecting voice not to be very accessible in this quantitative work, but I actually found there's a pattern of women who had come through reformatories in particular, when they're having their first encounter with the law, actively raising their age so that they won't get sent back to a reformatory, but that they will go to prison. And so like this is 19th century prisons are pretty miserable places, but these young women are saying, basically the thing is they can get into a jail and serve their sentence and get out. And in a reformatory, they can be kept till they're 21. You know, so and in a lot of ways is quite similar type of institution to a jail. So I'm constantly interested to see the ways in which you can find children and young people pushing back against the system, even though like that, you know, silver bullet of here's the voice, which I agree with David is kind of an elusive idea anyway. But yeah, there's all kinds of things that you can do to try and move beyond just always seeing things through the prism of the authorities and the institution.
And just to, that's, yeah, absolutely. And just to remembered something there around that, I actually met the person who wrote this newsletter in the 1970s. I was lucky enough to meet her, and she thought it was hilarious that I read so much into her words. She thought like that I kind of treated it like it was this holy, you know, sacred text of the institution, because this was the voice of the children, the one, and she just thought it was hilarious. So, you know, that she became the spokesperson for everybody, because that was the document that was kept, and it was her voice who had kind of done it. So just a bit of a warning around trying to find that authenticity. Yeah.
Thinking of Derrida too, and his whole idea of giving voice and the authorial eye, the idea. So yeah, is there another question? Because otherwise I've got another one for Nell.
Sure. I've also got a kind of comment for David.
Yeah.
No, you don't know.
Nell, I was just interested too in looking at the quantitative voices. Is there any way you've been able to contextualise the so-called reasons for people being in, other than the sort of poverty? Is there, or more, where are they coming from, or who are they? Have you been able to flesh that out a bit more? As in what families they're coming from? Are they, is it indigeneity? Is it multicultural? Is it the gold rush? Like, do we have a sense of where these children are coming from? Do you mean in the ones who have ended up in the criminal register, or just generally? Well, generally, but just the process, yeah. They are in the 19th century, almost all born in Australia, and almost all children of British migrants. There's actually not very much. There certainly are. There are some Jewish families. A really small number of Aboriginal children in the system in Victoria in the 19th century, for a variety of reasons. And also interestingly, there are some Aboriginal children in there who are not captured in the department statistics. I actually do have to go down to that fine-grained level of looking at individual records to even try and pick that up at all. They are, you know, and on the whole, I mean, look, it's easy to say, oh, you know, they're victims of poverty, but they're also really victims of a highly mobile migrant society. So, you know, the like a huge proportion are families who've lost their male breadwinner for some reason. He's deserted, or he has become unable to work for some reason, or has, you know, possibly died, because society just didn't really have a lot of solutions about how to support family units that had lost a male breadwinner. So they're overwhelmingly coming from mostly sort of working class suburbs around Melbourne, to some extent also from around the bigger centres on the goldfields and some of the bigger centres rurally, but those are smaller numbers. So those really are the types of families who are having the majority of encounters with the department in the 19th century. Yeah.
So I'm going to jump in and ask a question, or it's more of a comment, I guess, Dee, so I apologise. But, you know, it's such an interesting paper, and I was struck by the fact that, you know, the kind of deficit model that you were describing, we can see that in a number of different contexts. So, you know, I'm a criminologist, and when we talk about victimisation generally, then we employ a deficit model. You know, I'm thinking about in relation to survivors of sexual abuse, for instance, then a similar logic is at work, and the way in which that can serve as a kind of form of harm, further harm against victim survivors whose experiences don't accord with the kind of prevailing sort of narrative of victimisation and the impact that it has. But I guess my question is, like, is it like, I mean, is it possible to hold these multiple accounts in our hand at the same time, or do we risk kind of in some way erasing those others? So by reference to that kind of account that you're offering up, are we causing harm to those whose experiences don't kind of resonate with what you're describing? Sorry if I haven't explained that very well.
I think it's a really good point, but I think that we need to have a diversity of stories. Is kind of my point, that people who've been in state care or other forms of displacement from family are just absolutely not an homogenous group. There's a whole range of us, and some of us have had more positive experiences than others, and who can feel silenced if all we're ever talking about is abuse in care. But we can't not talk about abuse of care, because that would be silencing a whole, swag of people that's been silenced for a very long time. I think we have to move, and it reminds me though very much of the time when institutions were only talked about in a positive way, that people should be grateful for what the institution was offering. And now we have a range of different stories about those institutions and how, as David said, they tend to protect themselves rather than looking for the welfare of children. Now, not all of those, some of those institutions were absolutely better than others, and some of the people in those institutions were treated better than others as well. So I think we need to go with the complexity and perhaps take that risk that some people might feel excluded from the story. But if we've got a whole range, surely that's not going to happen.
Final comments or questions for our panel? Unless we do, in the few minutes that we have left, I mean, David, you mentioned doing this work for CAFs and what that looks like. So I might just kind of draw you out on that and what it means to be, working for this organisation that you're critically engaged in.
Yeah. Yeah, just briefly. And I guess it's part of wanting to be, part of an applied historical approaches that this project and others, I should emphasize, this is separate to this project and separate to my role at ACU. But essentially, so I did a PhD that was an industry-sponsored PhD with this organisation, CAFs, and a university, Federation University. And sort of the outputs that were expected from a sort of academic point of view, but from the funding institution, was they wanted the coffee table book. The university wanted the book, and the institution wanted a coffee table book that kind of told these, wonderful stories, really. We didn't do that. Instead, what we did, when we got to the end of it, there was a bit of a change of leadership within the organisation, and in the meantime, the Royal Commission had come out, that thankfully a pretty vivid realisation that you can't get away with just kind of telling those coffee table style stories about institutions anymore. So instead, we built a strategy, which is not necessarily very exciting in itself, but we wanted to really make sure that, the emphasis was going in the right way. And this idea of narrative identity formation, while not the kind of thing that you'd put into a strategy of a community sector organisation, but that's sort of embedded at multiple levels. So the really key thing that was done was kind of sorting out the record keeping and record storing and archiving. So the sort of the professionalisation, essentially, of the archiving of historical materials, which resulted in them in CAFs employing ongoing archival role, establishing all the professional requirements around that, and so we're able to provide advice into that about a historical understanding there, establishing a former resident advisory group who were able to inform on policy and procedure and so on, but also intent, and then establishing a like an exhibition. So there had been an exhibition established at this organisation, but it was that sort of old-fashioned version of beneficence and mercy and all those kind of stories. They had this sort of public exhibition space that served no one's needs and was really out of date in relation to what we know since the Forgotten Australians report, the Bringing Them Home report, and the Royal Commission. Incredibly, it had been done in 2015, this exhibition. So, whole nother story. But basically, we've redone that exhibition, and we're relaunching it in February next year through a, what you might describe as a co-design process with former residents, emphasising, sort of the creative reactivation of records rather than, the records as evidence, but, people are sort of doing artworks based on their records, revitalizing sort of reunions and so on, because just making sure that there's an emphasis on building trust, looking after record, building trust through doing the things that they need to do, which is looking after records and emphasizing that history, the histories belong to those people rather than to the institution, which is a big sort of structural and cultural shift from before, where it was like, these are our records, and how are we going to allow people to do that? So there's a whole bunch of specific things, and but yeah, that's sort of like making sure that the records are being respected and kept and are accessible and available, making sure that the input of former residents, as partial as that always will be with 4,000 former residents, sort of preferenced, and these kind of community-based sort of trust building and storytelling things. Oh, sorry, a really simple example. So before the foundation of the organisation was listed as 1865, because that was the day it was registered as a legal, those years registered as an entity when the first committee met, and the founders were recognised as, Emmanuel Steinfeld and, Henry, what's his name, like the mayor and all of that, who were on the first committee. We've now got the founders are those first 9 children who came in, and their establishment date is 1866. So it's like it's a specific historical point to make. And, I always try not to come across as like sort of pedantic when I point it out that it's 1866, not 1865, but it's an important cultural symbol to the rest of the organisation, that's who we value, and these are the stories that are valuable. So the names have been, the rooms and buildings have been renamed after those original children in 1866, and so that's a really simple example. But yeah, and also we're developing training for record keepers to kind of emphasise their role as historians now, and when they're keeping records about children in out-of-home care now, or in any number of their programs, an awareness that, the historical impact or the future impact of the record keeping that they're doing. So that's just a few.
So David, can I just ask, therefore, is that at one institution that's had to go from telling one favourable story to telling a diversity of stories about, and how comfortable or uncomfortable have they been with that?
Like impressively, comfortable in the uncomfortableness of it. It is a major challenge, and they are, you'll see, if you see the story that I told you about, they're incredibly, the ABC story, they're incredibly challenging stories, and they, they are part of the, National Redress Scheme. They will be part of the State Redress Scheme, and they have made many payouts. So it's a, it has consequences for them. But, I think there's a growing realisation in this post-Royal Commission world, if we can call it that, that actually the more risky path is to ignore these things, and the more risky path is to pretend that it never happened or that you were somehow different, because we have the testimony now, we have the evidence, such as it is, that this was a broad-based culture that people need. So I think that there has been a really, I believe, pretty impressive embracing of that, and knowing when to listen, knowing when to get out of the way, with notable exceptions along the way where it is, the responses can be really disappointing.
It always seems quite ironic to me that the institutions that have tried to protect their reputations have in the end trashed them.
Well, yeah,
by not taking action. Yeah.
Yep, that's right. And here in Ballarat, as in everywhere else, but in Ballarat, the reputation of the Catholic Church has been, really well, what can you say about it? Except that, yeah, by burying your head in the sand, you invite more risk than by not doing so. But that's a job that Nell and I have a big job trying to convince people about within our Australian Catholic University.
Good luck.
Yeah, having visited that exhibition before and when I met you last time there, you know, I look forward to seeing it after it relaunches in February. So
Yes.
so much to each of you. That was a really fascinating paper. I incorrectly described it at the start as continuing the theme of memorialisation, in fact, continue the theme of dark histories. But thanks to the three of you, to all of the participants. If you want to join me in thanking our speakers. Everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.